Okay, I want to welcome everyone to actually our second and last Montreal is Seen By for this semester. And I'm so thrilled because today we're going to have a Montreal is Seen By with Zev Moses. I'll introduce him in a minute, but I also just want to introduce myself. My name is Marianne Potnin, and I teach in Quebec Studies. And Samuel Jacquier will ask the questions of Zev Moses. I also want to mention that this session is being recorded, so just so you have that information. So we'll start first with the land acknowledgement.
Yes. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that while we meet today on a virtual platform, McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are part.
Thank you.
So now,
okay, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to introduce Zev, and then you'll post the questions. Okay, so the other thing I also wanted to mention is that this Montreal is Seen By is supported by the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, the Centre for Interdisciplinary Research on Montreal, Quebec Studies, and the Quebec Studies Student Association. So I'm very happy that they remain involved because I think this is a really important series. Zev Moses. Zev Moses, I've known him for quite a few years, I think almost, I guess from 2010. He's been very generous with my students in Quebec Studies. He's a graduate from McGill University with a BA in Political Science and History, and then he received a master's in City Planning from the University of Pennsylvania. In 2010, he founded the Museum of Jewish Montreal, an innovative place to connect with Montreal's diverse Jewish life and heritage through new arts and cultural experiences. And he currently serves as the museum's director. So please welcome Zev Moses and Samuel Jacquier.
Okay, so as Professor Putanen just said, you graduated from McGill University with a BA in political science. Then you went to do a master's in city planning in Pennsylvania. But have you always had in mind the idea of coming back to Montreal to establish this museum?
Well, that's a great question to start. And by the way, before I start, I want to thank some people that I know that are here also, between Marco and of course Marianne and Melanie and Marianne Pinsky, who's here, who actually started first research assistant that I had on this project. So it's really great to have Marianne there. I see Melanie's here too. So thank you for coming to all those people. And the answer to the question is no, to be honest. I don't think I ever planned to do this work. This was a surprise for me. And what's been even more of a surprise is how long it's lasted and what it's turned into. And I think, I mean, as we'll get in further in the interview, just things take interesting twists and turns every couple of years with this project and building this museum and where it's going. But no, my background was, when I was in McGill undergrad, I was kind of floating, you know. I was, and by the way, I 100%. If you can do it, I bless that. I think there's a time for doing a little bit of floating and just learning for the sake of learning and not having an exact purpose. You know, I was interested in poli-sci and history at that time, still am, but just not as a career, I would say. And even when I did my master's degree, I think that was a testing ground for it. You know, I had an inclination that I was interested in cities. And went to a wonderful program for the study of cities and study of urban planning itself, but I realized fairly quickly that I did not want to be an urban designer or planner either. I just was interested in cities, and that's kind of what led to me creating this museum. I think our slogan, or one of our slogans, is that the city is our museum. So, but it's been a lot of left turns for sure.
Okay. So what do you think is so important about keeping the Jewish history alive in Montreal?
You know, I think there's a couple of reasons that it's important. Number one, well, first of all, I think in Canada we sometimes don't respect our own history enough, because we're a little bit on the edge of we're not at the center of the world necessarily, and yet Canadian history is just as valid as any other history in the world. And I think the same thing goes for the Jewish history that happened in Canada. Montreal is really the center of Jewish history in Canada. That's not to take away from other sites of Jewish history in Canada and elsewhere, but it's really an important spot. Probably outside of New York and maybe one or two other places, Montreal is really just one of the most unique Jewish historical stories of the last 250 years, and definitely in North America. It's really, really unique. So that alone is a reason to take care of it, and not just preserve it, but to nurture it a little bit. I think of history as tied to, it's a starting point. It's a building block for identity and culture and meaning for a lot of people, whether you're Jewish or not. I mean, obviously my work is focused on Jewish history, but it really goes beyond that. And if you don't have a really good sense, a well to draw from, then it's hard to kind of create new culture, even new art, and give people a sense of their background, if they have a fairly superficial view of it. So that's one of the reasons I think more globally about it. But Montreal, it's a really incredible template to work from, because it's the Jewish community in Montreal is so diverse, has so many different types of experiences, and there's just so much to pull from. We could do research for decades and never run out, as I'm sure Marianne can tell you as well. And she focuses on a specific chunk of that history, especially with education, but there's always more to dig, and so that's what's really exciting and makes me excited about it still today after 10-12 years.
Thank you. Your organization was already primarily online at the start of the pandemic, if I'm not wrong. Do you think this gave you a good head start at the start of the pandemic? So what lessons did you have to learn along the way, anyways?
So, our museum started in 2010 or so. I mean, it was really just a research project in 2010 that was online. And Marian Pinsky, who's here, was like deeply involved in that for the first year or so. We started in 2012 or 13 to lead walking tours outdoors, and digital tours also online. By 2014 and 15, we were doing actual physical pop-up exhibitions. And in 2016, we actually opened our first storefront space. So we were actually more physical museum by the end of 2019, 2020. Things were really humming on the physical level, to the extent that our online presence, it wasn't necessarily suffering, but we weren't able, just trying to run a physical storefront and all the activities probably meant that we didn't spend as much time on the online as we had for 3 or 4 years earlier. About a month and a half into the pandemic, the landlord of our space freaked out a little bit and sold the space, and immediately we were evicted out of that space. So we lost our space in May, June of 2020. We were already, working digitally at that point anyway, because everyone was working digitally at the beginning of the pandemic. But yeah, it's been 2 years kind of without an active space. But the fact that we had some online background in the beginning was helpful. But I think any organization, from schools to businesses to other cultural organizations, had to make a shift very quickly to figure out how to do programming on Zoom or other types of online technology. So I don't think that shift was any different for us than anyone else. I don't think it gave us that much of a head start or advantage, but and I would also say I'm of the belief that hybrid is really the best thing anyway. And that was the direction all museums were going in even before the pandemic, was to create more and more content online, but to also make the in-person experience really special and unique. And I really believe in that. I think as long as it's safe, we want to be able to do in-person experiences. It adds a layer of community that you just can't get online, or that doesn't feel quite the same online. And that's definitely the direction we're heading back towards right now.
Okay. So what are your biggest day-to-day challenge? Like promotion, budgetary, the archival work itself, all of it maybe?
Yeah, it's all of those things. I mean, the last 2 years have been very challenging. First, it was, a real deep fear before the government came in and started supporting different businesses and organizations to maintain themselves through the pandemic. We looked at the worst hit sectors of the economy due to COVID, and it was like tourism and like events and food, and then charities were like number 3, especially arts and culture. I think more on the ground frontline services were getting a lot of funding. So that the first few months of the pandemic were quite scary. I think we were a little concerned we weren't going to make it, but in the end, we pulled through, probably in certain ways stronger than we had been before. And we ended up being able to pivot in the last 2 years towards more, mostly online, but community building types of activities, and especially working with young people in or around the Jewish community in Montreal to empower them to be creators for us of programming, of research, of art, just through a variety of programs like micro grants that we've been doing. In terms of the day-to-day, I don't think it's that different for us than other small nonprofits. Just making sure we're on top of all of the administrative tasks that occur. I would definitely tell anyone that's thinking about running a small nonprofit, you're going to spend more time on the admin work, unfortunately, than some of the fun creative work, but as long as you're able to have empower good people to do that creative work for you, and you get to see it, then it can be it still feels good to work on a budget when I know that it's allowing other people to do amazing work. So but yeah, I suppose if I had all the resources in the world, I'd only get to do creative work, but for now it's not the case.
Okay, thank you. Are there any interesting upcoming projects you would like to promote?
Probably, yeah. Well, we have an event this evening. I can try to find the link for it and put it into the chat in a moment when I'm not speaking, although I might be speaking the whole time, I'm not sure. I mentioned that we've been running a kind of micro grants program over the past couple of years. We piloted it in 2019, 2020, really in 2020, and it has just blossomed in such an amazing way to start creating. I think one of the things that we learned from, I'm stepping back a little bit, one of the things we learned from only focusing first on history was that it had a kind of limit to some degree in terms of how it could impact the future. But as soon as we were able to take history and combine that with arts and culture, just really creative, substantial, well-informed projects started to occur, and people started to, oh, thank you, Marion. There's the link in the chat. There's a cool, oh no, that's the link for next week's event. That one's cool too, but something tonight But anyway, all these really interesting projects happened that were steeped in history, but like moved beyond it, kind of took a piece of history and said, okay, well, how do we apply this to today, and make it super relevant to, people who are not studying history? Because, I love history. I literally read history for fun. But I know that 99% of the population probably doesn't, and that's okay. But how can we make history, how can we make heritage relevant to people? So all that said, that was one of the background things. Another thing that we were really concerned about was how could we create larger networks of people who were interested, who could be empowered to be part of the rebuilding and the regrowth of Montreal's Jewish arts and culture. And I mentioned this microgrants project that we've had. And I think we've given out funding to over 20 different young individuals, people kind of under 30, to go out and do projects, really whatever they want, as long as it touches on Jewish arts and culture and heritage in some sort of way. You don't have to be Jewish, by the way, to sign up for it. And we run it in two different kind of formats. There's like a professional development cohort for some of the grantees every fall. So if anyone's interested in that for next fall, usually applications go out in August or September. And then we also have a kind of a rolling open call that goes out throughout the winter into the spring. And we're hosting a couple events per month that just kind of highlight a project that someone's doing that relates to Jewish arts and culture. A lot of it has to do with Montreal as well. There's a project tonight, and I'll find the link in a few minutes, but there's an artist named Sonia Bazar from Montreal, who discovered around the Sauvé metro station. I don't know if anyone's been to the Sauvé metro station or been outside of the Sauvé metro station. It's in Huntsic, so it may not be your neighborhood, but if you walk outside of the metro, surrounding it on both sides of the street is a cemetery that kind of sits diagonally on the corner of Sauvé and I think is it Berry or La Jeunesse? I forget which corner it is there. It's the name of the cemetery is the Back River Cemetery. It's the oldest Jewish cemetery that's not connected to other cemeteries. So the oldest Jewish cemetery in the city is actually on Mount Royal. It's kind of part of the Mount Royal Cemetery constellation, I guess, up in Outremont. But the oldest only Jewish cemetery is kind of strangely, or for us today, is in Huntsic, because that was never a Jewish neighborhood in the city. And she was walking out of the metro and she looked around and she said, oh my gosh, every grave here is Jewish. And then she spoke to her family and realized that some of her own ancestors were buried there. She ended up doing a really in-depth research project. She's a photographer as well, went to, I think, Concordia and Art Institute in Chicago, and basically has created a book of writings and photos about the cemetery. Maybe the most, oh, nice, we found a link. Thank you so much, Marianne. So maybe the most interesting part about that cemetery, I'm going into a lot of detail here, she found a single grave that was not for a person. And this was very intriguing to all of us. So it was a grave for a Torah, like the Jewish holy books. So there's a tradition, or there's a religious tradition within Judaism, that for any holy books that include God's name in them, you can't just throw that out when it's like torn up and ready to be thrown out. You're supposed to bury it and put it there's a ritual way of burying those documents. So a Torah even more so. That's like the most holy Jewish document you could have. And it came from a synagogue that still exists today, the Bag Street Shul, which is the last remaining operational synagogue in the plateau right now. And the truth is, on our walking tours at the museum, we take people to the Bag Street Shul. What I found fascinating is, I know some basic history about that synagogue. But it's never been a huge synagogue. It's been a smaller congregation for decades and decades that just kind of hung on, whereas the other Jewish synagogues moved more to the west end of the city or further out into the suburbs. The synagogue's still there, and I had no idea that there had been a fire at that synagogue. I still don't know which year. I think maybe you'll find out tonight if you go to the event. But there was a fire in the synagogue. The Torah scrolls caught fire, so they had to bury the Torah, and they created a gravestone for the Torah, which is incredibly rare. Normally that's not done. So these are the kind of hidden things that are in the city. And this is where we take history, or we empower someone to take history, and then they take it in a totally new direction that honestly I would never have come up with. None of my staff would have come up with. But as soon as we just put a little bit of money out there for people to go and make their projects come alive, suddenly all sorts of creativity is occurring. And the impact of it is already appearing for me. It's we're creating a bit of an ecosystem for Jewish arts and culture in the city. The different micrograntees and other artists are starting to meet each other and work together and collaborate and become friends. And I think that would be for me. I mean, I don't know where things will be 5-10 years from now, but that for me is the ultimate success of this project, to empower people in that way and to create community out of a museum.
Okay, thank you. So Professor Putanen invited a lot of guests during our seminar, and a lot of them works for Jewish organizations, like Janice Rosen. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She's the executive director of the Alex Zworkin Canadian Jewish Archives. And how does your job differ? And do you work in collaboration with other actors?
Yeah, so I mean, our museum is not an archive. Perhaps you could call it a bit of a digital archive, but it's really not an archive. It's museums work to interpret documents, objects, experiences. We're very flexible with how we define our own museum within the world of museums, but I still think we count. There are two very significant Jewish archives in Montreal, the Jewish Public Library Archives and the Canadian Jewish Archives. And you mentioned Janice, who works there. So we work in partnership with them. A lot of our initial work to create an online resource with kind of a couple hundred online exhibits mapped around the city, a lot of the contents from that came from archives like Janice's, the Canadian Jewish Archives. But no, we don't hold on to any objects. We don't have the facilities to preserve them. And I think with those two institutions, we don't want to get in their way either. I think they're doing a great job. So it's our job to bring things out of different archives and different people's stories and bring that to life in a new way that's very public oriented, I'd say.
Okay, about the public, does your organization has like a target audience, or everybody's welcome and everybody's want to come?
I mean, true. Everyone is welcome, and we want them to come. And I mean, we do have different target audiences for different types of programming. I would say, our walking tours and our food tours, to some degree, that's, a Montrealer is only going to go on our walking tour a couple times. I mean, we have 5 or 6 of them, but you may not want to go on the same thing over and over again. So there's a bit of the target audience for those skews towards tourism and also school groups, but also, of course, Montrealers that are curious. It's a great way to learn about the city and find out things that you might walk by every day and realize there's a whole story behind it. In terms of our public programming and our exhibitions, and when we get back into a new space, we'll go back to having contemporary art exhibitions 3 or 4 times a year. That's really, I suppose there's a core of reaching out to, I would say, young members of the Jewish community in Montreal and their networks. And we're really expansive in terms of what we say who Jewish is. I don't think you have to be traditionally Jewish to fit in that. It's just people who either identify it as that, or have a family member, or part of, are just curious about Jewish culture and art and stuff like that. And then it goes beyond that. It's just to the general public. I would say, that are interested in arts and culture in the city and looking at diverse experiences and viewpoints. So the doors are really open for literally anyone. And I think people have responded that way in the past. At our programming, especially in our previous space. I mean, we didn't ask anyone at the door, what's your background, religious? I would never do that. But often certain events, I would have bet that more than half the people at the events weren't Jewish at all. And I think that's the direction we want to continue to go in. Be really welcoming for members of the Jewish community who are looking for new ways to connect their identity in arts and culture, but also be super welcoming to just the broader Montreal, public as well and beyond.
Thank you. So talking about the Jewish community, how would you describe Montreal Jewish community nowadays? So we have seen in class that we should not consider religious community as a monolithic group. Do you agree with that assessment?
Oh yes, definitely. I would call it communities. I might, you sometimes have to say community to just speak about it for, like, I guess, a demographic purpose, but no, it's it's many communities with many experiences, and more with each community. There's differentiations. So let's say you're a Moroccan Sephardic Jew. You may be different. There's even differences within that group. But there's at least 4 or 5 different large scale communities that could be identified, I would say. And some people also have multiple identities within the Jewish community. So you might be, your parents might, there's more and more people who have a parent that is Ashkenazi or Eastern European Jewish, and a parent who is Moroccan or North African Sephardic Jewish. That's really common. There's also, like, differentiations between religious practice as well. As everyone, I think, knows, there's a fairly large ultra-Orthodox community in Montreal, and probably growing. But even within that community, there's the Hasidic part and there's the non-Hasidic part. And within the Hasidic part, there's multiple sects of Hasidic Jews as well. And it just gets more and more complex. And then there's linguistic, I don't know if it's divides, but linguistic differences. There's 100 different ways to break things up. And but also at the same time, there are some commonalities really across the board in some element of experience. So yeah, it's complex, but I think that's good. I would say Jews just generally are kind of a microcosm for the rest of the world. And that's why perhaps so many people study Jews in scholarship. It's kind of endlessly fascinating, but just manageable enough to kind of take a stab at trying to handle one part of the scholarship. But and I think Jews are also very interested in researching themselves, because of so much movement across the world over so many years. So anyway, I'm not going to go too far on that, but so the answer to your question is many.
Thank you. Something more contentious now. So what is the state of anti-Semitism in Quebec now, and more specifically in Montreal?
I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I'll put it out there. I wouldn't call myself the expert on this topic. Obviously, I follow it and pay attention to what's going on around me. There is some sense, I would say, we'll hear it from tourists, especially people from outside of Montreal. Well, isn't there a ton of anti-Semitism in Quebec? I sometimes hear that there's some kind of rumor that exists, which I think comes from 2 different things. One is 2 different events have led to that. One is that a lot of Jews left Montreal and moved down the 401 to Toronto or elsewhere in North America. After the rise of the Parti Québécois in 1976, and in the 80s, early 90s, there were a lot of Jews, primarily Anglophone, who left town. not because of anti-Semitism, but because of, well, a variety of reasons, mostly economic, but also perhaps a sense of fear that something bad was going to happen. So that's one piece of that storyline. There's also a bizarre kind of connection that people make. There has been a really significant rise of anti-Semitism in France in the last 20 years. And I guess something happened for like American or other Canadian Jews that have assumed that whatever is happening in Paris is happening here. And I don't think that's true. All that said, so, I'm kind of saying there's not that much anti-Semitism in Montreal, but I will say in the past 5 years, there really has been an increase in anti-Semitism worldwide. And this is coming both from, a lot of radical right, but some radical left as well. Sometimes the two extremes touch, so to speak. But that experience is real. There have been more incidents in Montreal, but still, I would say it is a relatively safe. In fact, it's still a very safe place to be Jewish. Even outwardly so, in the streets of Montreal. But there are moments where that has been challenged, for sure. So I would say the answer is it's not, and people might disagree with me. I think it depends on your politics, but I would say it's not terrible in Montreal, but I think we keep an eye on it now, and no one is blue-skied thinking that this doesn't exist anymore.
Thank you. Does your organization offer resources to tackle anti-Semitism?
Oof. That's a tricky thing. Tackling anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism comes from so many different angles, right? A lot of it is tied to ignorance. And it also depends on what kind of anti-Semitism we're talking about. Are we talking about someone making, a remark or comment, in a workplace or in school that's uncomfortable, what we might call a microaggression, or even a little bit more than a microaggression? That is often due to, ignorance or reading bad information. In terms of actual violent acts or threats of violent acts, that's obviously much more rare. But often the people who have gone as far as a really violent act or threatening a violent act have been so immersed in a kind of a conspiratorial worldview. And anti-Semitism is like one of the world's oldest conspiracies. So those people are much harder. I don't think a museum is going to change their minds. In fact, the museum is usually a target for them, along with a synagogue or a school or a store. What a museum can do, and I think ourselves alongside the Holocaust Museum here, is to educate the public more broadly and to inoculate viewpoints. But I will say, a lot of kids will go to the Holocaust Museum. I think they're in grade 4 or 6. I forget how old they are when they go there. That's just an hour or two in their entire lifetime to get to learn about an event as big as the Holocaust. And they can come to our museum as well. But how many of us remember every field trip we went on when we were 8 or 10 or 15 years old? It has an impact, but what really has a bigger impact right now is being on the internet all the time and getting pulled down some weird K-hole on Twitter or Instagram or somewhere worse. This is a bigger issue in the last few years that goes beyond what just a museum can do. It's much more broad in society now. I see there's a hand up, by the way.
Yeah, and I've finished my questions, so I guess it's the perfect time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and by the way, I don't want us to get too caught up on Antisemitism. I think when I think about Jewish life in Montreal, I think about mostly that things are really positive and exciting and good, and there's just a lot of good stuff and a lot of creative things, and people are living really interesting lives that involve Jewish culture, civilization, religion within the city. And most of the time that's not impacted by anti-Semitism. I guess you can go and take questions from people, yeah.
Thank you for a great talk, Zev and Samuel and everyone who organized this. I have a comment and a question. So my comment, so I don't think my camera's on. My comment is just a follow-up to Samuel's question. I do feel that the museum, by its very nature of kind of exposing a community which maybe is seen as insular, or maybe only the Jewish community would know about the Jewish community, and because of that, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of the othering. I think the museum being so open and being so transparent and showing a heritage history of contributions, of historical developments, of scientific contributions, of artistic things, I think that's really breaking down this otherness in a really empowering way. It's building community and it's creating more cohesiveness. So I think you are definitely playing such an important role. I know we had mentioned about the Bonjour Shalom documentary by Gary Beitel, which explored the kind of dichotomy of two communities living side by side in Outremont, the ultra-Orthodox community and the French Quebecois community, and the tensions between the two because they don't have exposure to each other. And so it perpetuates a lot of stereotypes and a lot of hostility and antagonism. So I think I commend you for what your museum does. My question is really about place-based history. So I'm really interested about, I know that your kind of aha moment was when you kind of looked outside your window on Laval Street and you saw this, I don't remember what it was, an old factory or something like that, and you saw in the brickwork was a Magen David, a Star of David, and that kind of got your gears moving and was curious. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the old location where the museum was, and also how you came about to like, what were your criteria for your new location? I know that there's connections with Leonard Cohen, for example, but like, did you say like, we'll just take any old space that will have us? Or did you say, no, it has to be culturally significant? And kind of a part B of that question is, I know you had been interviewed by the Gazette about, I think it was a Polish butcher shop that closed recently. And maybe it wasn't Polish. And you were talking, Slovenia, okay, that's what it was. And you were talking about how that was important, kind of the landscape of the Maine. So anyways, that's a kind of a two-part question.
Yeah, it's many layered, but like all the parts of that question are fantastic. I think the story you're telling is, and this is what Mary Ann was pointing to as well. One of the aha moments that led to the creation of this museum was, I think it was on a balcony in my old apartment, looking out along Duluth Avenue and seeing a building that like really looked like a synagogue. And I remember Googling it, like it looked like the shape of an old synagogue, and there was the equivalent of a rose window on the top of it, but it had been bricked over. So it wasn't quite a Magen David or a Star of David, but it was similar. And I Googled it, and this is 2009 or so. Like Google had been around for a while, like everything was findable on Google in 2009. And I came up with 0 results. I typed in Duluth, Hotel de Ville, like synagogue, nothing. And I had to dig really far to find out that it was a synagogue. Eventually I confirmed it by going to the Canadian Jewish Archives where Janice Rosen works, and I found a phone book or an address book of Jewish synagogues in the 1930s. But that to me was kind of a sign that there were so many sites of Jewish history across the city, and especially in the Plateau arrondissement. Like, it just made sense that someone had to put this down online for the public to access. So that was that origin story. And in terms of when we found our first space, the goal, and now we're getting ready to open a new space in a better in a bigger location. How about that? I don't know if it's better or not. It's equally good. The goal was to be in that neighborhood because it's essentially it has a concentration of the highest number of historical Jewish sites in the city, I would say. And our walking tours are primarily in those areas. So the goal, at least initially, was to have all of our walking tours begin and or end at the space that we were in. We're moving to a new space, and we'll be announcing more news on that soon. Some of that news is changing actually, so but in an exciting and cool way that we'll announce to the public, I hope soon. But yeah, the idea is still, and we are going to be still within the historic Jewish neighborhood, although essentially not the current Jewish neighborhood. I see another hand up, Piers Young.
Yeah, hi. Okay, yeah, I have a couple questions for you. I'm just gonna try to be I'll say one, and if there's nobody else that has a question, okay, like it's just a question in the chat, but hopefully I'll get time for both. But I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, I hate to nitpick here. There was a moment where you caught yourself. You were saying a tradition, and then you corrected yourself into saying ritual tradition when you were talking about the burying of the Torah. And I was wondering if you could talk about this more, because obviously is a pretty wide berth here. And like when people talk about Judaism, they're not talking, there's like kind of two, right? There's the religion and there's the culture, there's tradition. And so I was just hoping you could talk a little bit about that, kind of like that dynamic between ritual tradition and tradition.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I caught myself because I actually wasn't sure if it's there's a variety. I mean, we're not going to go too deep into it, but there's a variety of types of Jewish law. And some are laws that come from the Torah, so to speak. They're literally written, do not murder, things like that. That are like, and then there's also laws that were developed through the Talmudic period and even beyond, it's called Dirabanan, which means from the rabbis, basically. The practice of burying a Torah, I'm guessing, would be written post the Torah being created, because it's about the object of a Torah. But I actually don't know. That's more religious question. Is that a tradition or is it an actual law? Again, I'm not sure, but I know at least it's a tradition and a ritual that has occurred, and I would call it a religious based ritual. In terms of Jewish, I mean, one of the most interesting things about Jews, we'll say that, is that Jews are both a religious group, and Judaism is a religion, but it's also a culture and a civilization, and also a nationality too, to some degree, a race. It's all of those things, and the upside is you get to opt into whichever part you want. The downside is some people don't like that you can opt in and opt out of whichever part you want. It creates a lot of challenges and tensions for people who want clearer rules and of how people should be, identified. So a lot of people that are interested in our museum have a religious background and might call themselves religiously traditional, but many of the people that come to us from within the Jewish community are people who are really not connected to synagogues or religious or traditional Jewish life, but have found a sense of their identity through culture, through history, through art, and heritage. And that's, I think we've created a bit of a home for those types of people in Montreal, and there's a lot of them. But people can be both. There's some people who might go to synagogue every week, but also are really interested in the kind of artistic side of things. It really depends. Does that help answer?
I have a question from chat. With both the Museum of Jewish Montreal and the Montreal Holocaust Museum moving to new locations on the Main, are there plans for collaboration between the two institutions?
Great question, and yes, we've already had our initial meetings to start those conversations. The timelines are a little bit different between the two projects. We're hoping to open within the next year, whereas the Holocaust Museum, I think it's 2026 or so. I forget the exact year. Don't quote me on that one. It's a few years away. Their project is a little bit larger than ours. So we'll be on different ends of the boulevard, but I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for really cool collaborations, programmatically, tours-wise. I think it will hopefully bring some more energy to the preservation and continuation of Jewish culture along that historic street. That will be good for tourism, but also good for just Montreal's sense of itself, to be able to grow that, to kind of preserve that in a more definitive way through those two institutions. So more to come. I don't know everything yet, and I think we have a lot more conversations to be had, but both institutions are super excited about the opportunity to work together. Yeah, I see another hand up.
Here's again, yeah.
Yeah, okay, just if nobody else has a question, I do have a second question, as I said. So you talked a lot about the start. Well, we talked a bit about the start, about how things are very unpredictable. You really didn't predict to be in the position you're in now. But I want to know, when did you know? Like, when did it go from this is a research project where you're just putting a few things online and moving on with other things, and you're like, what was the moment that you thought, wait a second, this is something, wait a second, this is a museum? You know what I mean?
Well, there was some point, I think it was 2010, 2011, when I was applying for funding and I had to give a name to the project. And I think our original name was I think it was Hidden Jewish Montreal or something like that. And I started pitching it to some funders, and no one was reacting well to that. I think they got this sense of like, what are we hiding? We're not, someone literally said, well, we're not Anne Frank. Like, it was a kind of a caustic joke. And at that moment, I brainstormed a bunch of other names that I sent to a lot of friends and people that I respected. And one of the names was the Interactive Museum of Jewish Montreal. So it took on that title then. That was somewhere around 2010 or 11. And by 2014 or 15, even before 2013 or 14, when I incorporated the museum as an actual, corporation, so we could, have our own pay taxes and payroll and stuff like that. We incorporated as just the Museum of Jewish Montreal, rebranded soon afterwards. So that's part of it, but I couldn't name an exact day where it happened. And the jump from online to in person was an organic process. I knew first we created dots on the map of exhibits, and then we said, well, why don't we link these together in a curated tour? And I think, Marianne, you were a little bit involved with that one, the Work Upon Arrival tour, about Jewish garment workers who had immigrated to Montreal. And when we had created that tour online, we were testing it. I remember myself and Stephanie Schwartz, our research director at the time, we were testing it, and we walked to the buildings, and we walked into one of the buildings where one of the factories was, and it was the Belco building, which is well known now for it's been a gallery building for a couple decades now. And we walked into the gallery, and it was more or less for rent, and we said, can we do a pop-up exhibition in here? And that's what led to our first in-person, physical exhibition. And the reaction to that was so big. A few thousand people came out just over a weekend. And that kind of gave me the bug for thinking, okay, I want to do this more than just for a weekend or for a couple of weeks. The next year we did it for a couple of weeks, and that was super successful too. And at that, somewhere in that range of 2014 or 15, I just knew that if we were going to continue, it needed to have a physical manifestation. And as soon as we started that, it was a whole new project to some degree. We became more than just a museum. It became an arts and culture and even a community space. And those transformations continue to happen, I'd say. And our next space is going to be really exciting in a lot of ways. I'm really excited about it, but it won't be traditional in any sort of way. I think we'll continue to try to break down some barriers as we go forward.
I had a question for you. I wondered if you couldn't speak a little bit about the summer program. You have interns,
Right.
university students, and it's very exciting. They learn a lot. They do projects. They do the walking tours, and I wonder if you could just comment on it.
It's a great time to comment on it because
I thought so.
Job opportunities on our website a week or two ago, and I think there's still another, I think till around April 3rd, 4th, 5th, somewhere until there, like people can apply. We run 2 types of fellowships each summer. I think right now we're calling it just a research fellowship this summer, but there's also opportunities to dive into Jewish food as well. This will be I believe it's our 9th summer of running fellowships. We started in 2014. It is a 12-ish week fellowship, paid internship. The first 2 or 3 weeks are, I would call it, bordering on a grad level kind of intensive course/training program. I know, Marianne, you're one of our teachers during those couple weeks, where we take our fellows really from knowing, you can walk in knowing 0 things about Jewish culture and history in Montreal, and then everyone is trained to be a walking tour guide for the summer, and becomes basically someone who helps animate our city through a Jewish lens for the rest of the summer. And also there's a great opportunity. I mean, there aren't walking tours every minute of every day. So in between, we have a lot of research projects that we give our students to work on each summer, either to develop new walking tours or exhibitions that we're working on, or to help us with our website. Oral histories as well is another activity that we work on during the summer. So yeah, that is coming up. I think applications are due around April 5th, but look on our website, check it out, and you'll find the actual date. The fellowship starts May 16th. Oh, Marianne, I think you're muted.
Any other questions or comments? We have a few more minutes.
Well, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to present today. It's really been a pleasure.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you. So it's just fantastic. So, and can I assume that things are going to get back to normal in terms of all of the different activities that you have provided in the past, and maybe taking on students, because I actually love the oral history program that you have. And
yeah, we had to put that on ice for a little bit of time,
yeah.
Hoping our oral history fellowship, that's a separate fellowship we run during the school year, hoping that would come back by winter.
Okay.
Yeah, obviously rebuilding in a new space, and this new space that we're going to have is quite a bit larger than the last space.
I'm so happy to hear that.
Not great in terms of space, but also we're going to be inviting more partners to be in there as well to work with. It's really going to be an exciting kind of community style space where a lot of things can happen, but it's going to take us a little longer than we had hoped. So I think we're looking now at a full opening in early 2023 and not in 2022 as we had hoped. That said, we're running a full walking tour program starting in May. We are already running some in-person events, including tonight, and just at different venues across the city. We're hoping to start doing some exhibitions, maybe in the fall, if we can find the right space for it. But still, the transition continues, I would say that.
And one last question. Is there going to be a restaurant?
That is the goal.
I loved your restaurant. Okay.
We're not going to run it internally anymore. I know that we're looking for a partner on that project, because we wanted to focus more on all the other pieces of what we do. But there will be an expanded food program otherwise as well. So I'm hoping for a dedicated food workshop space out, and I think there's going to be a lot of fun stuff.
Great. Thank you so much. And Samuel, thank you so much for the questions and your involvement in this, and Zev for, being enthusiastic, and you said yes right away when I asked. And anyway, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to all.
Bye.